What's happening, gang? We're getting ready to solder the guards on 4 Simians, getting ready to send them out. But I know a lot of people struggle with this, so I want to show how we do it. And it may not be the best way, but it's the way we've come up with, and it's we get full penetration with the solder, which we're really adamant about. If there are any gaps or anything that's beyond burnishing, well, we won't let the knife go out of the house. So anyways, we use Stay Clean Flux and Stay Bright silver bearing solder. Everything's been cleaned really well with denatured alcohol. Got in there with Q-tips and microfiber rags and cotton balls. So we're pretty confident that the joint's clean. And then from the top side, I can bring this in so you guys can see it. A pretty sparing amount of flux goes in. And we just run a little bead of flux all the way around the joint. Both sides. Don't forget the front. And then you can see it kind of starting to weep out in the bottom. That's what we're looking for. Anywhere that solder, that flux weeps to, we know that the solder in theory should flow there also. We clamp it, tip up in the vise. Now, a lot of guys don't do this, but we've been accused of overbuilding before. We clamp heat sinks to the blade to help protect it from any excess heat that may happen if there's a trouble in the solder joint or something like that. You may hover there with heat for a little bit too long, and these do work. We've seen knives as experiments, seen straw color run all the way up to the base of the heat sink, and then the edge is protected, so you still get that edge retention. We use propane because it works. We've also used heat guns in the past, but you get a pretty good flame going. And just really start heating that joint. I focus a little bit more on the guard than on the tang at first. I don't like exposing the knife itself to too much heat for too long of a period. You can see that solder starting to bubble. And it's pretty much ready when it caramelizes. You'll see it get kind of brown and gross. And it's usually about the point that it's ready to take the solder. But I start from the bottom here. You can see down here how it's getting kind of caramelized. So now I'm going to move my heat to the top. And just work that joint. And then I'll check it with the solder rod from the bottom. And when it's ready, there'll be no mistaking it. There we go. So it starts taking it from the bottom and through capillary action wicks it right up to the joint. And you can see it's flowing pretty nicely. Add a little bit more. Make sure you don't forget the back side. Okay, so now we inspect the joint. Watch out, please. Make sure it's coming out the back. You've got a nice even bead all the way around the bottom. Happy with that joint. If there was a lot of excess, and we'll just do it here for visual sake, I'll take a solder brush, brush it away, and then immediately we take the whole clamped assembly. Right here, we got a spray bottle with water. Don't spray it on the joint, just on the heat sinks. And then we throw the whole mess down in front of a fan. And while that guy's cooling, I take him. I'm going to go over to the bucket. The flux is obviously an acid, and it'll continue to corrode your blade if you don't get it off of there. And so I just take baking soda. Stuff's cheap, so I'm pretty liberal with it. Wet old toothbrush. And for me, the trick is not just rubbing the baking soda on it, but getting the baking soda into kind of a watery solution. And since we have full penetration on our joint, we're not worried about anything being between the guard and the blade. Everything's on the surface. See some guys go through all kinds of voodoo trying to clean this up, but the whole point of the silver bearing solder is to completely fill that gap. So boiling it, letting it soak, it makes no difference. You're cleaning the surface. And if you're worried about the acid being between the guard and the blade, then you didn't get a good joint. That's just my 2 cents. There you go. Looks good. And drag an iron over it just to kind of smooth it out a little bit. You can see it's a pretty minimum solder fillet. We got some bumps right there, but no inclusions. So, and you guys will see that in the cleanup. Very happy with it. Alright guys, so we got the guard joint all soldered up, and you can see there's little blobs of solder right here, a little bit of buildup, and that needs to go away so that the micarta can fit flush with the guard, so that the scale material can fit square to the guard. So what we're going to use is a square file. Let's see if you can see this. And one side has been ground smooth, and then we have 3 sides that have cutting ability. And this was a tip that I picked up from the Bob Loveless book. And all we're going to do is just set the smooth side down and start working that guard joint. Now the knife's in a hardened state, so you're not really removing any material from the tang, even though the teeth of the file are rubbing up against it. And you'll feel it. It's kind of, I guess, velvety is the way I would describe it. So when that's gone, when the solder's gone, it loses that velvety feeling. And then we move to flat side against tang. And this is the part where you can screw the knife up completely. If you were to hit it like this for any amount of time, or even just slightly angled, you'd end up knocking that rear corner, and your scale guard tang union is forever screwed. So you want to make sure that you're flat and even along the guard, and everything is super true and super square. This is cleanup for fit only. It's not really for aesthetics. So a little bit of solder on the guard, it doesn't make a big difference. What you're looking for is to make sure that scale can fit nice and comfortably. So we'll file that. I'll sight down it just to make sure, and then I have a very special tool that I made. Basically, I just heated up the shank of a screwdriver, pulled it out, and replaced it with some brass rod that was hammered flat. And I'll run that along that joint, really cram it into the crease there, and then that'll make sure that everything's out. Sight down it one more time, make sure everything looks nice and square and clean. Spot right. There we go. Okay, and so that's how we clean up the underside. Alright guys, so you saw the underside cleanup, and we're going to do the top side. These Simians are going to be blasted, so we're going to skip a couple of steps that would go into a finished knife. We'll do another video on those, like on a polished knife. We'll show those later. But right now, the only thing I'm concerned with is, number one, a really deep visual inspection on the joint to make sure there's no surface porosity, and to kind of smooth it out and make it look a little bit nicer. And so you can see there's little globs of solder here, here, and here, but from brushing it off, it came out pretty clean. Plus the method we use for soldering, by wicking it up from the bottom, you don't end up with a huge ship pile of solder on top that you have to file off. And so we're just going to drag, even though it's going to be a blasted guard, we don't want to scratch it, and even though it's just brass, it will still leave a pretty healthy gouge in it. So when you're working back and forth, don't load up your arm so much that it forces the graver off onto the face. You'll end up with a really deep scratch, and you'll have to sand it out, or it just looks like shit. So we get in there just real carefully, and I'll even use my thumb as like a little bit of a brake You can see it's ramming up against it but not going beyond it. And we're just burnishing that joint. Now working backwards you can be a lot more aggressive because obviously it just runs off the edge. And what we're looking for is a nice, it should look like mercury, like just a real silvery bead with no highs or lows, just a, should look liquid. And we got no, real careful, I'm going to come do the transition from the side to the front. We've got no holes, we've got no lumps, we have no major excess solder on the guard. Any little bit that is there will get blasted off. But if there's a, this brings up an interesting point, if there were to be like a blob of solder here, yes, sandblasting will take that off, but what happens is it won't take it off before it erodes the brass or nickel silver around that blob. So once it does come off, you actually end up with like the ghost of that solder. You'll end up with a lump right there, and then you're kind of hosed. I mean, it's just so much work, it's almost not worth doing, depending on how much you have into the knife. You can see I scratched it right there, but just real lightly, but it probably shows up pretty decent on camera. So be wary of that. Don't rely on the sandblaster to get all your solder off. You'll be grossly disappointed in the end if you do. Okay, this side, the reverse side, the other side's the obverse side. The reverse side I find a lot easier in cleanup because I'm right-handed, and so all my force and pressure is working towards the spine of the knife, so it's a lot less risk. And I'll take this guy. It's just a CO2 cartridge from a pellet gun with a brass rod, silver soldered inside the mouth, and I use him if there's a little bit extra solder. I can push it around and smooth everything out a little bit easier. For the guys that solder from the top, I'm not telling you how to do your shit, but I recommend soldering from the bottom the way we do. It makes this cleanup process so much easier. It results in a cleaner joint. And you know, I've had over the years had people tell me some pretty cool tricks, other knife makers and whatnot, and I think it needs to be passed on. There's a ass for every seat, so I don't think we're competing against each other as much as people on the outside might think. But chances are, if you're a knife collector, you've got knives from multiple makers, and we all want people to do the industry justice. You know, that's how I look at it. Is that I take being part of this pretty seriously, so I like to do a good job. I like to see other guys do good jobs. Sometimes they help me with stuff that I'm screwing up, and sometimes I'd like to help other people so that they can do a better job. And there we go. I mean, that's, I don't know if you guys can see that, but it looks pretty decent.